The hardwood floor felt cold against my cheek as I lay there stunned and humiliated in front of 23 family members who had gathered for Christmas dinner. My name is Connor, and I had just been shoved to the ground by my stepfather Richard after trying to sit in what I thought was my usual chair at our family table. The silence in the dining room was deafening as Richard stood over me, his face red with anger, adjusting his expensive wool sweater like nothing had happened. He looked down at me with pure disgust and said those words that would haunt me forever, but also ignite a fire inside me that would change everything. I slowly picked myself up from the floor, my hands shaking as I dusted off my khakis. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the uncomfortable silence that followed Richard's outburst. My mother Patricia sat frozen in her burgundy velvet chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her cloth napkin. She avoided my eyes, completely staring instead at the elaborate centerpiece of red poinsettias and golden ribbons she had spent hours arranging that morning. Richard smoothed down his perfectly groomed salt and pepper beard and announced to the room, "Connor should eat in the kitchen since family dinner is for real family members." His voice carried that familiar tone of authority he used when discussing business deals at his plumbing supply company. The crystal wine glasses on the mahogany table caught the light from the chandelier above, creating tiny rainbows that seemed to mock the darkness of the moment. My Aunt Susan, my mother's younger sister who worked as a pediatric nurse at Springfield General Hospital, immediately stood up from her seat near the bay window. Her emerald green dress rustled as she moved, and her silver bracelet jangled softly. "Richard, that's completely inappropriate," she said firmly, her brown eyes flashing with anger. "Connor has been part of this family for 8 years. Richard's laugh was cold and calculating as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. "Being part of a family means more than just living under the same roof, Susan. It means blood loyalty and respect. Connor has shown none of those things lately." He gestured toward the kitchen doorway with a dismissive wave of his manicured hand. "The boy can eat with the help." As I walked toward the kitchen, my face burning with shame, I caught glimpses of the reactions around the table. My cousin Jake, a sophomore at the local community college, looked down at his plate of untouched turkey and stuffing. Grandpa Joe, my mother's father, who had served in Vietnam and worked 37 years at the Ford plant, shook his weathered head in disappointment. His flannel shirt and worn jeans stood in stark contrast to Richard's designer clothing. The kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables and fresh dinner rolls, but my stomach churned with humiliation. I grabbed a paper plate from the stack near the industrial-sized refrigerator that Richard had insisted on installing last year. The contrast between my flimsy disposable plate and the fine china being used in the dining room felt like another deliberate insult. Through the thin walls of our 2-story colonial house, I could hear Richard regaling the family with stories about his latest business expansion. He owned 3 plumbing supply stores across the county and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of his success. His booming voice carried easily as he described purchasing a 4th location in the neighboring town of Millfield. I had spent 8 years trying to earn this man's approval. When I was 14 and he first married my mother, I joined the high school football team specifically because Richard had volunteered as an assistant coach. I endured 2 seasons of him screaming at me during practice, calling me weak and pathetic in front of my teammates. When I showed interest in art, Richard convinced me to study business, instead saying creative pursuits were for people who couldn't handle real work. Every summer since I turned 16, I had worked at his main store on Commerce Street, organizing inventory and helping customers load heavy pipes and fixtures into their trucks. Richard paid me $6 an hour, claiming it was more than I deserved for unskilled labor. I never complained because I desperately wanted to prove myself worthy of being his stepson. My biological father had died in a construction accident when I was 12 years old. A crane collapsed at the site where he was working as an electrical supervisor, killing him instantly along with 2 other workers. The life insurance money had been enough to pay off our mortgage and set aside funds for my college education. 2 years later, when Patricia met Richard at a church singles group, she thought she had found security for both of us. As I stood alone in the kitchen picking at a slice of ham on my paper plate, I heard Richard's voice rising in the adjacent home office. He was speaking on his cell phone, and something about his tone made me move closer to the doorway that connected the kitchen to his workspace. The office door was slightly ajar, and I could see him pacing behind his massive oak desk, his back turned to me. "I need everything transferred to Emma's name before December 31st, he was saying in a hushed but urgent tone. "The audit team is getting more aggressive, and I can't risk having these assets tied to my name much longer." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. "No, she doesn't know anything about it yet. I'll handle Emma when she gets back from college. The girl trusts me completely." My blood ran cold as I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, straining to hear more. Richard continued his conversation, unaware that I was listening. "Listen, Frank. I've been liquidating assets for months now. The cash is already moved offshore, but the business properties need to look legitimate. Emma's the perfect cover because she's been away at school and won't ask questions." The pieces began falling into place in my mind like a horrifying puzzle. Emma was Richard's 20-year-old daughter from his first marriage. She had been studying art therapy at a college 3 hours away and rarely came home except for major holidays. Her sudden return for Christmas, combined with Richard's demand that she sit in my usual chair, now seemed far more calculated than I had initially realized. Richard's voice dropped even lower, but I caught fragments of his words: "IRS investigation, hidden income, and plausible deniability." My hands trembled as I realized I was overhearing something that could destroy not just Richard, but potentially my mother and Emma as well, depending on how deeply they were involved. The conversation ended abruptly, and I heard Richard's footsteps moving toward the door. I quickly returned to the kitchen island, pretending to focus on my meal. When he emerged from his office, his face was flushed, and his jaw was clenched tightly. He glanced at me with suspicion, as if he sensed something but said nothing, before returning to the dining room. The sound of laughter and conversation from the family gathering felt hollow and distant now. I realized that the humiliation of being pushed to the floor was nothing compared to the magnitude of what I had just discovered. Richard wasn't just a cruel stepfather. He was apparently a criminal who was planning to use his own daughter as an unwitting accomplice in his schemes. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom with a sense of purpose I had never felt before. The pale, winter sunlight filtered through my curtains, illuminating the trophies and certificates that represented years of trying to please Richard. My high school football awards, my Business Honor Society membership, my perfect attendance certificates from working at his store, all of it felt meaningless now that I understood who he really was. I called my college roommate Marcus, who was spending winter break at his parents' house in Detroit. Marcus was a computer science major with a talent for finding information that others preferred to keep hidden. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and supportive. "Dude, that's seriously messed up," Marcus said, his voice crackling slightly through the phone connection. "But if this guy's running some kind of financial scam, there's going to be a digital trail somewhere. These older business owners always think they're smarter than technology, but they leave breadcrumbs everywhere." Marcus walked me through the basics of what to look for: unusual money transfers, discrepancies between reported income and actual deposits, and any documentation that might reveal the scope of Richard's illegal activities. He also taught me how to use remote access software to examine Richard's business computers without physically being present. That afternoon, I volunteered to help with inventory at the main store, something I had done countless times before. Richard seemed pleased that I was taking initiative, especially after the previous night's confrontation. "Finally showing some work ethic," he commented as he handed me the keys to the warehouse section. "Maybe there's hope for you yet." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me, as I spent the next 4 hours carefully examining financial records and business documents. What I discovered was far worse than I had imagined during that overheard phone conversation. Richard's plumbing supply business was essentially a front for an elaborate tax evasion scheme that had been operating for at least 5 years. The legitimate business income was being systematically underreported to the IRS. Richard would record only about 60% of his actual sales, keeping the rest as unreported cash income. He accomplished this by maintaining 2 sets of books, one for official purposes and another that tracked his real earnings. The difference was staggering. Richard was probably evading taxes on nearly $400,000 per year in hidden income. But the tax evasion was only part of the scheme. Richard had also been paying many of his employees under the table, avoiding payroll taxes and workers' compensation insurance costs. When I examined the employee files, I found that several workers were being paid significantly less than minimum wage, with Richard pocketing the difference and falsifying their time cards. The most disturbing discovery came when I accessed the employee benefit accounts. Richard had been collecting workers' compensation insurance premiums from his employees' paychecks, but had never actually purchased the coverage. If any of his workers were injured on the job, they would discover that their insurance was non-existent. As I dug deeper into the financial records, I found evidence of another betrayal that hit much closer to home. The college fund that my biological father's life insurance money had established was supposed to contain nearly $68,000. According to the bank statements I found hidden in Richard's desk, the account now held less than $12,000. Richard had been systematically withdrawing money from my education fund and funneling it into his personal accounts. The documentation showed that Richard had forged my mother's signature on numerous withdrawal authorizations. Since she was listed as the account custodian until I turned 21, her signature was required for any major transactions. Patricia had been unknowingly signing away my future while trusting her husband to handle the family finances. My hands shook as I photographed document after document with my phone. Each piece of evidence revealed another layer of Richard's deception and greed. He wasn't just stealing from the government or his employees, he was stealing from his own family. That evening, I contacted Detective Ray Morrison, who had worked with my biological father at various construction sites before joining the police force. Ray had been a pallbearer at my father's funeral and had stayed in touch with our family over the years. When I called him, I could hear the concern in his voice immediately. "Connor, I'm glad you reached out," Ray said when I explained the situation. "We've actually had our eye on Richard's businesses for several months now. The IRS contacted us about some irregularities they noticed during a routine audit. They've been building a case, but they need more concrete evidence to move forward." Ray explained that federal investigators had been trying to get someone inside Richard's operation, but his employees were too scared to cooperate. Richard had a reputation for ruthless retaliation against anyone who crossed him, including threats to destroy their employment prospects throughout the county. "But you're in a unique position," Ray continued. "You have access to the business records and the family's financial information. If you're willing to work with us, we might finally be able to bring this guy down." The thought of betraying my mother's husband, even knowing what he had done, felt overwhelming at first. But then I remembered the contempt in Richard's voice when he called me illegitimate. The years of psychological abuse disguised as discipline, and the workers who were being cheated out of fair wages and benefits they had earned. "I'll do whatever it takes," I told Ray. "But I need to make sure my mother and Emma don't get hurt in the process. They're innocent in all this." Ray assured me that the investigation would focus on Richard's criminal activities, not on prosecuting family members who had been deceived. He arranged for me to meet with a federal agent who specialized in financial crimes, and we began planning a strategy that would protect the innocent while ensuring that Richard faced justice for his actions. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of my mother and Richard arguing in their bedroom down the hallway, I realized that the boy who had been humiliated at the Christmas dinner table was beginning to transform into someone stronger and more determined. Richard had underestimated me, completely assuming that I would remain passive and grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance he chose to offer. But he was about to learn that sometimes the people you dismiss as weak are actually gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to stand up and fight back. The investigation was just beginning, and I was going to make sure that every person Richard had wronged would finally get the justice they deserved. 3 days after Christmas, I met with federal agent Sarah Chen at a small diner on the outskirts of town. She was a financial crime specialist with the Treasury Department, and her expertise in following money trails had helped convict dozens of white-collar criminals over the past decade. Agent Chen was professional, but warm, immediately putting me at ease despite the serious nature of our meeting. "What you've uncovered so far is impressive," she said, reviewing the photographs I had taken of Richard's financial documents. "But we need to establish a broader pattern of criminal behavior to ensure our case is airtight." She explained that successful prosecution of financial crimes required evidence of intent pattern and significant monetary impact. Marcus had driven down from Detroit to help with the technical aspects of the investigation. Using his laptop and specialized software, he was able to remotely access Richard's business computer network during off hours when the stores were closed. What we discovered was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple tax evasion. Richard had been running what amounted to a shell game with his business assets and personal wealth. He owned the 3 plumbing supply stores through a complex web of limited liability companies and partnerships that obscured the true ownership structure. When one business showed significant profits, he would transfer the money to entities that reported losses, minimizing his overall tax liability. But the most shocking discovery was the extent of his theft from employee benefits. Richard had been collecting Social Security and Medicare taxes from his workers' paychecks, but had never forwarded the money to the federal government. Over 5 years, this had amounted to nearly $200,000 in stolen payroll taxes. Agent Chen explained that this type of theft was particularly serious because it directly harmed the workers whose benefits would be affected when they tried to retire or claim disability. Several of Richard's long-term employees were approaching retirement age and had no idea that their Social Security accounts didn't reflect the contributions they thought they had been making. The investigation also revealed that Richard had been systematically defrauding his business insurance carriers. He would file false claims for damaged inventory, often claiming that perfectly good merchandise had been destroyed in warehouse accidents or weather-related incidents. The insurance payouts were then laundered through various business accounts before being transferred to his personal holdings. Marcus's technical skills proved invaluable when we discovered that Richard had been intercepting my college scholarship checks. I had received several merit-based scholarships during my senior year of high school, but none of the money had ever reached my education accounts. Richard had set up a mail forwarding service and had been cashing the checks himself using forged signatures and false identification. "This is federal mail fraud in addition to everything else," Agent Chen noted as she reviewed the evidence. Interfering with scholarship distributions is a serious federal crime that carries significant penalties. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when we examined Richard's plans for Emma's unwitting involvement in his schemes. Richard had prepared legal documents that would transfer ownership of all his business assets to Emma's name, making her the apparent owner of companies worth over $2 million on paper. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its callousness. If the federal investigation intensified, Richard could claim that he was merely an employee working for his daughter's businesses. Any criminal charges would theoretically fall on Emma, who had no knowledge of the illegal activities. Meanwhile, Richard would quietly disappear with the millions of dollars he had hidden in offshore accounts. Agent Chen's expression grew grim as she reviewed the asset transfer documents. He's setting up his own daughter to take the fall for his crimes, she said quietly. Emma could face decades in federal prison for crimes she doesn't even know are being committed. The evidence also showed that Richard had been preparing to frame me as a potential conspirator. My computer access at his business combined with forged documents bearing my signature could be used to suggest that I had been involved in the financial irregularities. If investigators looked only at the surface evidence, it would appear that the stepson with access to the books had been helping to steal from the company. He's been planning this for months, Marcus observed as he analyzed the digital timestamps on various documents. Every time you worked at the store, every time you accessed the computers, he was building a case against you. The realization that Richard had been manipulating me, even as he planned to destroy my future, was almost more than I could bear. I had spent years desperately trying to earn his approval, never realizing that he saw me as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat for his criminal activities. Agent Chen outlined the next steps in the investigation. We needed to gather additional evidence, while avoiding any actions that might alert Richard to our activities. She provided me with sophisticated recording equipment that would capture high-quality audio of any incriminating conversations. The key is to get him talking about his plans, she explained. Recorded admissions of criminal intent are among the most powerful forms of evidence in federal court. But time was running out faster than we had anticipated. That evening, I overheard another phone conversation between Richard and his mysterious contact. Richard's voice was more agitated than before, and I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. The timeline has moved up, Richard was saying. I need everything finalized before New Year's Day. The audit team is asking more specific questions, and I can't risk having these assets exposed much longer. He paused, listening to the response, then continued. Emma signs the papers tomorrow, and then we disappear. I've already booked the flights to Montana. My brother's ranch is isolated enough that we can lay low until things cool down. The conversation revealed that Richard was planning to flee the country within days, not weeks, as we had originally believed. Once he transferred his assets to Emma and left the state, building a case against him would become exponentially more difficult. I immediately contacted Agent Chen with this new information. She informed me that the federal task force was ready to move. But they needed one final piece of evidence, a recorded confession from Richard that clearly established his criminal intent and his plans to frame innocent parties. We have one chance to get this right, Agent Chen warned me. If Richard's suspects were onto him, he'll destroy evidence and disappear before we can stop him. You'll need to get him to admit his crimes on tape, and you'll need to do it within the next 24 hours. As I prepared for what would be the most important conversation of my life, I thought about all the people Richard had hurt his employees who trusted him with their livelihoods. Emma, who loved her father despite his flaws. My mother, who had been betrayed and manipulated, and me, the stepson he had never wanted but had used for his own purposes. The scared 12-year-old boy who had lost his father was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that sometimes justice requires courage, planning, and the willingness to stand up to people who seem more powerful than you are. Richard had pushed me to the ground at that Christmas dinner, but he was about to discover that I'd gotten back up stronger and more determined than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, I realized that confronting Richard alone would be both dangerous and strategically foolish. If I was going to expose his crimes and protect the innocent people in his path, I needed allies who could help ensure that justice would be served properly and completely. My first call was to Betty Morrison, Richard's bookkeeper for the past 6 years, and Detective Ray Morrison's sister-in-law. Betty had worked at the main store since Richard acquired it, and I had always noticed her nervous behavior around him. She was a quiet woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, who seemed to flinch whenever Richard raised his voice. When I approached Betty at her small apartment near downtown, she initially refused to speak with me. "I can't get involved in this, Connor," she said through the chain-locked door. "Richard would destroy me if he knew I was talking to you." But when I explained what I discovered about the stolen employee benefits, and the fraudulent insurance claims, Betty's resolve began to weaken. She invited me inside her modest living room, which was decorated with photographs of her grandchildren and inspiration sayings cross-stitched by her mother. I've known something was wrong for years. Betty admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard would bring me 2 different sets of numbers for the same transactions. When I asked about the discrepancies, he told me that I was too stupid to understand sophisticated accounting practices. Betty revealed that Richard had been systematically intimidating her to maintain her silence. When her husband suffered a heart attack 2 years earlier, Richard had threatened to fire her and cancel her health insurance if she asked too many questions about the business finances. Since her husband's medical bills were enormous and his disability payments were minimal, Betty felt trapped in her position. He knew exactly how to control me, she said, tears forming in her eyes. Every time I thought about reporting the irregularities, I noticed he would remind me that my husband's life depended on keeping my job. With Agent Chen's guidance, I was able to offer Betty protection under federal whistleblower statutes. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony, she would receive immunity from prosecution and assistance in finding new employment once Richard's businesses were shut down. Betty's detailed knowledge of Richard's financial manipulations proved invaluable. She had been keeping personal copies of documents that troubled her, creating an extensive paper trail that corroborated everything Marcus and I had discovered through our electronic investigation. My next ally came from an unexpected source. Tommy Rodriguez. One of Richard's warehouse workers approached me when I arrived at the store that afternoon. Tommy was a 45-year-old father of 3 who had been working for Richard for nearly 4 years. His weathered hands and sun-damaged face told the story of decades spent in manual labor. I heard you were asking questions about the business, Tommy said quietly, as we stood between towering shelves of PVC pipes and copper fittings. There's some things you should know that ain't in any books. Tommy explained that Richard had been running a secondary operation that involved selling damaged or returned merchandise to unlicensed contractors at below-market prices. These off-the-books sales generated substantial cash income that never appeared in any official records. The contractors paid in cash and received no receipts, while Richard pocketed the money without paying any taxes on it. He's got a whole network of guys who buy stuff from him this way, Tommy continued. Mostly people who work on smaller residential jobs and don't want to deal with permits or inspections. Richard supplies them with cheap materials and looks the other way when they cut corners. This revelation added another dimension to Richard's criminal enterprise. He wasn't just evading taxes and stealing from his employees. He was also contributing to dangerous construction practices that could result in building failures and safety hazards for homeowners throughout the region. Tommy had been documenting these transactions because he was worried about the legal liability of being involved in potentially unsafe construction projects. He had photographs of damaged materials being sold as functional equipment records of cash transactions and contact information for several of the unlicensed contractors. I got kids to think about, Tommy explained. If someone gets hurt because of defective materials Richard sold under the table, I don't want to be the one holding the bag when the lawyers start looking for someone to blame. Through Tommy, I was able to contact 2 other employees who had been keeping their own records of Richard's illegal activities. Maria Santos, who handled customer service and inventory management, had been tracking the discrepancies between actual inventory and reported stock levels. James Patterson, the assistant manager at the second store location, had documented Richard's practice of forcing employees to work off the clock during busy periods while still deducting full payroll taxes from their reduced wages. Agent Chen arranged for all of these witnesses to meet with federal prosecutors under protective circumstances. Each employee provided crucial pieces of evidence that strengthened the overall case against Richard while ensuring their own legal protection. But my most important ally turned out to be someone I had never expected to trust completely. Emma returned from college that evening, and I knew I had to make a decision about whether to reveal what I had discovered about her father's plans for her future. Emma was shorter than I remembered, with shoulder-length blonde hair and the same green eyes as Richard. She had always been polite to me during family gatherings, but we had never developed a close relationship due to the age difference and her absence during most of the years I lived in the house. I found her in the family room surrounded by college textbooks and art therapy materials. She was working on what appeared to be a research project about using creative expression to help trauma victims process their experiences. The irony of her studies wasn't lost on me, given what I was about to reveal about her father. "Emma, I need to tell you something important," I began carefully. "It's about your father and some things he's been doing with his businesses." Her initial reaction was defensive, which I had expected. "If this is about what happened at Christmas dinner, Connor, I'm really sorry. Dad can be harsh sometimes, but he doesn't mean anything personal by it." But as I showed her the evidence of Richard's criminal activities and his plans to transfer business ownership to her name, Emma's expression changed from skepticism to horror to determination. She was studying to become a therapist specifically because she wanted to help people who had been hurt by others. The realization that her own father was systematically victimizing his employees and family members was devastating, but also galvanizing. "He's been planning to make me responsible for all of this?" she asked, staring at the asset transfer documents. "He would let me go to prison for crimes I never even knew about." When I explained the federal investigation and the urgent timeline we were facing, Emma made a decision that surprised me with its immediate clarity and courage. "I want to help," she said firmly. "My father has been lying to everyone, including me. If he thinks he can use me to escape responsibility for what he's done, he's about to learn that I'm not the naive little girl he thinks I am." Emma's inside knowledge of Richard's personality and habits proved crucial in planning our final approach. She knew which topics would make him angry enough to reveal his true intentions, and she understood how to manipulate his ego into making him want to brag about his criminal cleverness. "Dad has always needed to feel like the smartest person in the room," Emma explained. "If we can make him think he's proven how superior he is to everyone else, he'll talk about things he should keep secret." With our alliance of witnesses, federal agents, and unexpected family support, we had assembled everything needed to bring Richard's criminal enterprise to an end. But the window for action was closing rapidly. Richard had already begun the process of transferring assets to Emma's name, and his plans to flee to Montana were scheduled for New Year's Day, just 36 hours away. Agent Chen coordinated our final preparations, ensuring that all evidence was properly secured and all witnesses were protected. Detective Ray Morrison positioned local law enforcement to provide backup support when federal agents made their move. Marcus prepared digital recording equipment that would capture high-quality audio and video of Richard's confession. As I prepared for the confrontation that would determine Richard's fate and the future of everyone he had victimized, I felt a strange sense of calm. The scared, approval-seeking stepson who had been pushed to the floor at Christmas dinner was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real strength comes from protecting others and fighting for what's right. Richard had spent years underestimating me, dismissing me as weak and worthless. He was about to discover that the boy he had rejected and humiliated had grown into someone capable of bringing his entire criminal empire crashing down around him. On December 30th, I woke up to the sound of Richard shouting into his phone in the kitchen below my bedroom. Even through the closed door and the thick walls of our old colonial house, his agitation was unmistakable. The timeline that had already seemed impossibly tight was about to become even more compressed. I crept to the top of the staircase and listened as Richard paced frantically between the kitchen and his office. "No, you don't understand," he was saying to someone. "The IRS audit team called yesterday afternoon. They want to schedule a comprehensive review of all business records for the first week of January. We have to move everything today." My heart sank as I realized that federal investigators had inadvertently triggered Richard's panic by following their normal audit procedures. Agent Chen had warned me that Richard might accelerate his timeline if he felt pressured, but I hadn't expected it to happen this quickly. Richard's voice rose as he continued his conversation. Emma signs the transfer papers this morning, and we're on a plane to Montana by tonight. I don't care what it costs to change the flights. This whole operation is compromised if we don't move now. I immediately texted Agent Chen with this new development, then called Marcus to activate our emergency recording protocols. We had planned for this contingency, but executing our strategy on such short notice would require perfect coordination and a significant amount of luck. The first challenge was ensuring that Emma would be ready to play her part in the confrontation. She had spent the previous evening reviewing the evidence and preparing psychologically for the difficult task of manipulating her father into revealing his crimes. When I found her in her childhood bedroom, she was pale, but determined. "I keep thinking about all the people he's hurt," Emma said, as she applied makeup to hide the fact that she had been crying. "The employees who trusted him, the contractors, he's been cheating even Mom and you. How could I not see what kind of person he really was?" I tried to reassure her that Richard's deception had been sophisticated and long-term. "He's a master manipulator," I explained. "He specifically targets people who want to trust him and believe in family loyalty. That's not a character flaw on your part. It's evidence that you have the kind of heart he's been exploiting." Emma's psychology training proved valuable as she analyzed her father's behavior patterns and prepared for the emotional manipulation we would need to employ. "Dad's narcissism makes him vulnerable," she observed. "If we can get him talking about how clever he's been, his ego will override his caution, But Richard's paranoia was intensifying by the hour. When I came downstairs for breakfast, I found that he had installed new security cameras in the hallway and family room overnight. He was monitoring everyone's movements with the obsessive attention of someone who knew he was running out of time. "Where have you been spending so much time lately?" Richard demanded when he saw me enter the kitchen. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, with his shirt wrinkled and his hair uncombed. "I've noticed you leaving the house at odd hours and taking phone calls in private." I had prepared for this moment, but the intensity of his suspicion was still unnerving. "I've been working on college applications for next semester," I lied smoothly. "Some of the financial aid offices have limited hours during winter break." Richard's eyes narrowed as he studied my face, looking for signs of deception. "Financial aid offices," he repeated slowly. "Interesting that you would need financial aid when your college fund should have plenty of money in it." The comment was clearly designed to test my knowledge of his theft from my education accounts. I forced myself to remain calm and confused-looking, as if I had no idea what he was implying. "I thought it would be smart to apply for additional scholarships and grants," I replied. "College costs keep going up every year." Richard seemed satisfied with this response, but his body language remained tense and watchful. He was clearly under enormous stress, and I knew that any wrong move could trigger him to abandon his plans and simply disappear with whatever assets he could grab immediately. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness as we waited for the right moment to initiate our confrontation. Emma played her part perfectly, acting excited about the business transfer documents while secretly recording Richard's explanations of what she would need to sign. "I'm so proud that you're trusting me with such important responsibilities," Emma said, as she reviewed the legal papers. "Can you explain exactly what these companies do and how the ownership transfer will work?" Richard's response revealed the depth of his criminal planning and his complete disregard for Emma's well-being. "These are sophisticated business structures," he explained condescendingly. "You don't need to understand all the details. Just sign where I've marked the papers and everything will be properly transferred." But Emma pressed for more information, using her training in therapeutic communication to draw out additional details. "I want to be a responsible business owner," she insisted. "What if government officials or accountants ask me questions about these companies? I should know how to answer them." Richard's ego couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his superior intelligence and business acumen. He spent nearly an hour explaining the complex web of shell companies, hidden assets, and fraudulent financial structures he had created. Emma's hidden recording device captured every word of his self-incriminating admissions. Meanwhile, Marcus was monitoring Richard's business computer networks and discovered that he had begun deleting financial records and employee files. The destruction of evidence was systematic and thorough, designed to eliminate as much documentation as possible before investigators could examine it. "He's wiping everything," Marcus reported via encrypted text message. "Bank records, payroll files, customer accounts, he's trying to eliminate the entire digital trail." Agent Chen responded by accelerating the federal task force timeline. Search warrants were prepared for immediate execution, and arrest teams were positioned near all of Richard's business locations. But we still needed Richard's recorded confession to ensure that the case against him would be airtight and that Emma would be completely protected from any potential prosecution. The opportunity finally came that afternoon when Richard received a phone call that sent him into a rage that overcame his usual caution. One of his unlicensed contractor contacts had been arrested on an unrelated matter and had apparently mentioned Richard's name during questioning. "That idiot is going to ruin everything," Richard screamed into his phone. "I told him never to mention my name if he got caught selling substandard materials. Now the whole off-the-books operation is compromised." Emma seized the moment to ask innocent-sounding questions that drew out more admissions. "Dad, what's wrong? What off-the-books operation are you talking about?" Richard's response was a tirade that included detailed descriptions of his tax evasion schemes, his theft from employee benefits, his insurance fraud, and his plans to frame both Emma and me if investigators got too close to the truth. "I've been planning for this day for months," he boasted angrily. "If the federal investigators want to play games, they'll find out that Emma owns all the businesses and Connor had access to all the financial records. Let them try to prosecute a college girl and a stepson who was desperate for approval." The recording captured everything we needed: clear admissions of multiple federal crimes, evidence of his intent to frame innocent family members, and detailed descriptions of his money laundering and tax evasion operations. But even as we achieved this crucial breakthrough, the walls were closing in faster than we had anticipated. Richard announced that he was moving the departure time to 6 o'clock that evening. "Pack only essential items," he told Emma. "We're leaving for Montana tonight, and we're not coming back until this investigation blows over." Agent Chen confirmed that federal agents were ready to execute search warrants and make arrests, but the timing would be critical. If Richard left the house before agents arrived, he might escape prosecution entirely and leave Emma to face charges for crimes she had never committed. As I prepared for the final confrontation that would determine everyone's fate, I realized that the scared, rejected stepson who had been humiliated at Christmas dinner had transformed into someone capable of fighting back against injustice and protecting the people he cared about. Richard had spent years trying to break my spirit and destroy my confidence, but his cruelty had ultimately created an opponent he was completely unprepared to face. The race against time was entering its final phase, and everything would be decided within the next few hours. Richard thought he was about to escape with his stolen millions while leaving others to pay for his crimes. He was about to discover that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who bring about your downfall. At exactly 4:30 that afternoon, everything came together in a moment that would change our family forever. Richard was in his office making final arrangements for the evening flight to Montana when Emma and I positioned ourselves in the family room where Agent Chen's recording equipment could capture everything clearly. Emma had suggested that we confront Richard together, using our combined knowledge to force him into making additional admissions that would ensure his conviction while protecting everyone he had victimized. The plan required precise timing and careful psychological manipulation, But Emma's therapy training and my intimate knowledge of Richard's personality gave us confidence that we could succeed. "Dad," Emma called out as she walked toward his office. "Connor and I need to talk to you about something important before we leave for Montana." Richard emerged from his office looking harried and suspicious. His expensive business suit was rumpled, and his usually perfect grooming showed signs of the stress he had been under. When he saw us standing together in the family room, his eyes narrowed with immediate wariness. "What do you two want?" he demanded. "I told you we're leaving in 90 minutes and I don't have time for family discussions." I took a deep breath and began the confrontation that I had been preparing for my entire life. "We know about the money you stole from my college fund," I said quietly. "We know about the tax evasion and the fake insurance claims, and we know you've been planning to frame Emma and me for your crimes." Richard's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally a cold rage that revealed the true nature of his personality. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said slowly. "And even if you did, there's nothing you can do about it." But Emma stepped forward with the asset transfer documents in her hand. "Actually, we know exactly what you've been doing," she said calmly. "And I'm not going to let you use me as your scapegoat." The recording equipment captured every word as Richard lost control of his temper and began revealing details that he should have kept secret. "You think you're smart enough to understand sophisticated business operations?" he sneered. "I've been running circles around federal investigators for 5 years while you were playing with dolls and finger paints." Richard's ego and anger combined to create a perfect storm of self-incrimination. He bragged about his criminal cleverness while simultaneously threatening both Emma and me with retaliation if we interfered with his escape plans. "I built an empire worth millions of dollars," he continued ranting. "I employed dozens of people and provided services to thousands of customers. If I had to bend a few rules about taxes and regulations, that's just smart business. The government takes too much money from successful entrepreneurs anyway." When I challenged him about stealing from his employees' benefits, Richard's response revealed the depth of his callousness. "Those people are lucky to have jobs at all?" he said contemptuously. "Most of them are too stupid to understand what Social Security and workers' compensation actually provide. They're better off with cash in their pockets right now than promises about future benefits they'll probably never collect." Emma pressed him about his plans for transferring business ownership to her name. "Did you really think I would just sign papers without understanding what I was agreeing to?" she asked. Richard's laughter was cold and calculating. "You've been signing papers without reading them your entire life," he replied. "Birthday cards, school permission slips, Christmas lists. You trust your father to handle the important details while you focus on your little art projects." The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Richard revealing increasingly damaging details about his criminal activities. He admitted to bribing a county inspector to overlook safety violations at his warehouse. He described his network of unlicensed contractors who purchased substandard materials that could fail catastrophically in residential construction projects. Most damaging of all, Richard explained his detailed plan for framing Emma and me if federal investigators got too close to the truth. "Emma owns all the businesses on paper," he said with satisfaction. "Connor had computer access to all the financial records. If anyone goes to prison for tax evasion or employee theft, it's going to be the two of you, not me." But the conversation took an unexpected turn when my mother, Patricia, entered the family room, apparently drawn by the sound of raised voices. She had been upstairs packing for the sudden trip to Montana, and her face showed confusion about the heated discussion she had walked into. "What's going on down here?" she asked nervously. "Richard, why are you shouting at the children?" Richard's response to my mother revealed the complete absence of love or respect in their marriage. "Stay out of this, Patricia," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you. Just go back upstairs and finish packing like I told you." But I decided that my mother deserved to know the truth about the man she had married and the danger she was in. Mom, Richard has been stealing from my college fund, I said gently. He's been forging your signature on legal documents and using you to help hide his crimes. Patricia's face went pale as I explained the forged withdrawal authorizations and the systematic theft of money that my biological father had intended for my education. When Emma showed her the asset transfer documents, Patricia's hands shook as she recognized her own forged signature on multiple pages. "You've been lying to me about everything," Patricia whispered, staring at Richard with growing horror. "Our entire marriage has been built on deception and theft." Richard's mask finally fell away completely as he realized that his control over the family was disintegrating. "You're all too stupid to understand what I've accomplished," he screamed. "I turned 3 failing businesses into a profitable empire. I provided security and stability for this family when nobody else could." But his rant was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in our driveway. Agent Chen Detective Morrison and a team of federal investigators had arrived with search warrants and arrest warrants. Richard's time had finally run out. The look of shock and panic on Richard's face as he realized he had been trapped was something I will never forget. For the first time in my life, I saw him as he really was, not a powerful, successful businessman, but a frightened criminal who had been caught in an elaborate web of his own making. "This is impossible," he stammered, looking around the room as if searching for an escape route. "You couldn't have organized something like this. You're just a stupid kid who couldn't even earn a place at the family dinner table." But Emma stepped forward with a calm dignity that surprised everyone in the room. "Actually, Dad, we've been working together for the past week," she said clearly. "Connor figured out what you were doing, and I helped gather the evidence the federal agents needed to arrest you." The recording equipment had captured everything: Richard's detailed confessions, his threats against family members, his plans to frame innocent people for his crimes, and his complete lack of remorse for the people he had victimized over the years. As federal agents entered our house and began reading Richard his rights, I felt a strange combination of satisfaction, relief, and sadness. Justice was finally being served, but it came at the cost of destroying the only family structure I had known for 8 years. Richard was handcuffed and led away to a federal detention facility, where he would await trial on charges that could result in decades in prison. His criminal empire was about to collapse, but the people he had hurt would finally receive the justice they deserved. 6 months later, I stood in the courtroom as the federal judge sentenced Richard to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He had pleaded guilty to tax evasion, mail fraud, employee benefit theft, insurance fraud, and conspiracy charges in exchange for a sentence that could have been much longer if the case had gone to trial. The financial restitution alone exceeded $800,000, covering stolen employee benefits, unpaid taxes, fraudulent insurance claims, and the money taken from my college fund. Richard's business assets were liquidated to pay victims, and his personal wealth was seized under federal forfeiture laws. Betty Morrison, who had testified courageously about the financial irregularities she had witnessed, received a settlement that allowed her husband to get the medical care he needed without worrying about insurance coverage. She found a new job with a legitimate accounting firm that appreciated her attention to detail and ethical standards. Tommy Rodriguez and the other warehouse workers received back pay for overtime hours they had worked without compensation, plus damages for the workers' compensation coverage that had been stolen from their paychecks. Several of them used the settlement money to start their own small businesses, applying the skills they had learned while working for Richard, but with honest business practices. Emma transferred to a local college so she could rebuild her relationship with our family while continuing her studies in art therapy. The trauma of discovering her father's true nature had been devastating, but she channeled her pain into her academic work and developed a specialization in helping families recover from financial abuse and betrayal. "I want to help other people who've been victimized by family members they trusted, Emma explained as she showed me her senior thesis project. Financial abuse is often overlooked because people assume that family members wouldn't deliberately hurt each other, but it's actually one of the most common forms of domestic violence. My mother, Patricia, filed for divorce and used the settlement money to return to school for a master's degree in social work. Her experience with Richard had given her insight into how manipulative people target and control their victims, and she wanted to use that knowledge to help other women escape from abusive relationships. I spent 8 years making excuses for his behavior. Patricia admitted during one of our long conversations about healing from Richard's betrayal. I convinced myself that his criticism and control were signs that he cared about our family's success. I never recognized the psychological abuse until I saw him turn that same manipulation against you and Emma. The house where I had grown up became a symbol of our family's recovery rather than a reminder of past humiliation. We renovated Richard's office into a study space where Emma and I could work on our college assignments together. The family dining room, where Richard had pushed me to the floor that Christmas evening, became a place where we hosted dinners for Betty Tommy and the other people who had helped expose his crimes. Detective Ray Morrison, who had been instrumental in coordinating the federal investigation, became a regular visitor to our house. He shared stories about my biological father's integrity and work ethic, helping me understand that the values I had inherited were far more valuable than anything Richard could have taught me. Your father would be proud of what you accomplished, Detective Morrison told me as we worked together in the garage, restoring some of my father's old construction tools that Richard had hidden away in storage. Standing up to corruption and protecting innocent people, that's exactly the kind of man your father was. Marcus, my college roommate who had provided crucial technical assistance during the investigation, became like a brother to me. We started a small computer consulting business that specialized in helping small businesses improve their financial record-keeping systems. Our motto was transparency through technology, and we took pride in helping honest entrepreneurs avoid the kinds of financial irregularities that had destroyed Richard's empire. Agent Sarah Chen, the federal investigator who had coordinated the case against Richard, became a mentor who helped me understand the importance of financial integrity in both business and personal relationships. She encouraged me to consider a career in forensic accounting where I could help law enforcement agencies investigate white-collar crimes. You have a natural talent for following money trails and understanding complex financial schemes, Agent Chen observed. More importantly, you have the ethical foundation necessary to handle cases where financial crimes destroy families and communities. The scholarship money that Richard had stolen was not only recovered but supplemented by additional grants from organizations that support children who have lost parents. I was able to complete my business degree without any financial stress, and I graduated with honors while maintaining a clear conscience about how my education was funded. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the relationship that grew between Emma and me. What had started as a strategic alliance to stop Richard's crimes evolved into a genuine sibling bond based on shared values and mutual respect. I always wanted an older brother, Emma told me as we prepared for her college graduation ceremony. I just never expected to find one in the stepbrother I had ignored for so many years. Richard tried to keep us separated because he knew we would be stronger together than apart. The legal proceedings also led to broader reforms in how employee benefits are monitored and protected in small businesses. Richard's case became a model for federal prosecutors pursuing similar crimes, and several new regulations were implemented to prevent employers from stealing from workers' compensation and Social Security accounts. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that humiliating Christmas dinner, I realized that Richard's cruelty had ultimately been the catalyst for my transformation into someone stronger, wiser, and more determined to fight for justice. The boy who had been pushed to the ground had gotten back up and brought down a criminal empire through patience, planning, and the courage to stand up for what was right. My biological father's life insurance money, which had been intended to provide security and opportunity for my future, had been stolen and then recovered through a process that taught me invaluable lessons about integrity, persistence, and the importance of protecting people who cannot protect themselves. The college fund was restored and actually grew through investment returns and additional grants, but more importantly, I had gained an education in justice and morality that no classroom could have provided. I learned that real strength comes not from seeking approval from powerful people, but from having the courage to challenge them when they abuse their power. Today, I work as a financial crimes investigator for a federal law enforcement agency, helping to expose and prosecute people who steal from employees, evade taxes, and betray the trust of their families and communities. Every case I work reminds me of the importance of speaking up when you witness injustice, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice and courage. The dining room table where Richard once told me I didn't belong now hosts weekly family dinners where Emma, Patricia, and I share stories about our work, our dreams, and our commitment to building a family based on love, respect, and honesty, rather than fear, manipulation, and control. Sometimes I think about Richard in his federal prison cell serving time for crimes that hurt dozens of innocent people. I don't feel hatred or satisfaction about his punishment, but I do feel a deep sense of peace knowing that justice was served and that the people he victimized were able to rebuild their lives with dignity and security. The seat at the Christmas dinner table that Richard claimed belonged only to his real daughter has become irrelevant. We built our own table where everyone is welcome based on their character and kindness, rather than their genetics or legal status. The family I have now is stronger and more loving than anything Richard ever provided because it's built on truth instead of lies, support instead of manipulation and justice instead of exploitation. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you trusted was secretly working against your best interests? How did you find the courage to stand up and fight back when the odds seemed impossible? I'd love to hear your stories of overcoming betrayal and finding justice in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over adversity, and share it with anyone who might need to know that sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up making us stronger than we ever thought possible. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that no matter how dark things might seem, there's always hope for justice and healing when you have the courage to stand up for what's right